The gavel was about to fall. The auctioneer, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in a state of mild procedural boredom, had called the final bid for Parcel B twice. Going once, going twice. In the front row, the bank's attorney, a man named Davies, gave a tight, satisfied smile to the developer beside him. The developer nodded back. 400 acres of foreclosed farmland, the old Miller place, for pennies on the dollar. It was a good day for the bank. It was a better day for the development company that would buy it from them an hour later. The room was stuffy, smelling of old paper and damp wool coats. Most of the other bidders, local farmers and small-time investors, had already put their hands down. They watched the proceedings with the quiet resignation of men who knew the game was over before it started. The bank always won. Then a voice, clear and high, cut through the stale air. $300. The auctioneer stopped, his hand hovering over the wooden block. The room went quiet. Heads turned. The voice had come from the back, near the heavy oak doors. Davies turned too, his expression shifting from satisfaction to annoyance. He saw a boy, maybe 13 years old, standing straight in a clean plaid shirt. Beside him stood an older man, his hands resting on the boy's shoulders. The boy looked small in the cavernous room. The auctioneer cleared his throat, a dry, rustling sound. "On which parcel, son?" The boy didn't hesitate. "Parcel C." A laugh escaped from Davies, just a short, sharp bark of amusement. He turned back to the developer and shook his head. The developer smirked. Parcel C. Of course. It was a ghost parcel, a clerical remnant on the county plat maps. 12 feet wide and running half a mile, it was listed in the foreclosure as a drainage ditch, a worthless, unsellable strip of weeds and runoff. The auctioneer looked at his ledger. He seemed confused for a moment, then shrugged. It was on the list. He had to call it. "I have a bid of $300 for Parcel C. Any other bids?" Silence. Davies half rose from his seat, as if to protest the waste of time, but the auctioneer was already moving. $300 going once, twice, sold. The gavel fell with a flat, final crack. To the young man in the back. The boy didn't smile, he just gave a small nod. The old man squeezed his shoulder gently. Then they began to walk forward down the center aisle toward the front of the room. The old man carried a long cardboard tube under his arm. His work boots made no sound on the worn linoleum floor. No one in the room understood what had just happened. They only knew that the clean, predictable rhythm of the day had been broken. Something was wrong. The room itself was a study in institutional beige. The walls were the color of weak coffee, the ceiling tiles were stained with the ghosts of old leaks, and the light from the tall arched windows was filtered through a film of dust that seemed decades thick. The bidders sat in rows of mismatched wooden chairs, the kind usually reserved for church basements. They were men who understood land in a way that had nothing to do with zoning variances or projected equity. They understood soil and water and the slow, unforgiving passage of seasons. And they understood the look of a man like Davies. His suit was dark grey, sharply tailored, the fabric holding a crispness that seemed alien in the humid air. He was young, with a watch on his wrist that cost more than most of the tractors parked outside. He was from the city. He was from the bank, Sterling National Bank. The name was printed in elegant, subtle letters on the leather portfolio in front of him. For the last hour, he had been the center of the room's quiet gravity. He spoke in low, confident tones to the developer, a man whose own expensive suit was softened by a layer of ambition and sweat. They were a pair, two sides of the same coin, turning a family's loss into a future of cul-de-sacs and manicured lawns named after the trees they would cut down. The man walking forward with the boy was the opposite of all that. He wore a simple press shirt and denim trousers.
the cuffs of which were clean, but permanently dusted with the memory of dry earth. His hands, resting now at his sides, were weathered and calloused, the knuckles thick. He was maybe 70, his face a map of sun and worry, but his eyes were clear and steady. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, as if he had measured the distance from the back of the room to the front and knew exactly how many steps it would take. The boy, Leo, walked just ahead of him, his expression serious, his focus entirely on the auctioneer's table.
They were a strange sight, this old man and young boy, an echo of a different time intruding on a modern transaction. Davies watched them approach, his amusement already curdling into suspicion. He leaned toward the developer. Probably some sentimental local, he murmured. Thinks he's buying back a piece of his childhood. The developer grunted, his eyes fixed on the cardboard tube under the old man's arm. The other farmers in the room were not looking at Davies anymore. They were looking at the old man. A few of them nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of recognition. This was Will Croft. He wasn't a man given to sentiment, and he certainly wasn't a man to waste $300 on a ditch. Something was happening. The air grew thick with unspoken questions. The quiet shuffle of papers and the clearing of throats that had filled the room moments before had ceased. There was only the sound of Will Croft's boots on the floor and the steady, rhythmic ticking of the large clock on the wall. A clock that seemed to be measuring a different kind of time altogether. To understand the cardboard tube, you have to go back not just a few weeks to when the auction notice was posted, but back 47 years to a hot afternoon in the summer of 1971. Will Croft was a young man then, his hands just beginning to show the deep lines of a life spent working with his hands. He was standing at a fence line with his neighbour, old man Miller. Thomas Miller was in his 60s, a farmer whose family had worked the same 400 acres since the land was granted to them after the Civil War. They stood in the tall grass, the sun beating down on their necks, looking out over the vast expanse of Parcel B. Miller was a good man, but a tired one.
His health was failing, and his children had moved away, drawn to cities and lives that didn't follow the rhythm of the sun and the soil. He had made a hard decision. He was selling the main parcel, the big farm, to a development group out of the state capital. He spoke about it in a low voice, his gaze fixed on the horizon. They made a good offer, he told Will, more than it's worth for farming. But he wasn't selling everything. He was keeping the original 5-acre homestead, Parcel A, where the old family house stood, surrounded by a grove of ancient oaks. The problem was that the homestead would be landlocked, an island surrounded by the new development. I need a way in and out, Will, Miller said, kicking at a clump of dirt with the toe of his boot. A way that nobody can ever take away. Will listened. He was good at listening. They talked for an hour, planning. Miller didn't trust the developers to grant him a simple right-of-way in their master plan.
He had seen promises like that fade with new ownership or changing plans. He wanted something permanent, something made of paper and ink and law. So they devised the solution. Miller would carve out a new, separate piece of land from the main parcel before the sale, a thin strip just 12 feet wide, running from the county road along the old fence line all the way back to the edge of the homestead property. It would be its own parcel, Parcel C. It would have its own deed, and that deed would state in clear and binding language that its sole purpose was to provide permanent access to Parcel A. It would be a recorded appurtenant easement. The right would belong to the land, not the owner. It would run with Parcel A forever. They went to the county seat the next week, to the same courthouse where the auction would one day be held. They sat with a young lawyer who drew up the deed for $50. Will watched as Thomas Miller signed his name with a shaky hand.
Then Will signed as a witness. He made a promise to his neighbour that day. "I'll keep an eye on it, Thomas. I'll make sure nobody ever forgets what this strip of land is for." Miller had clapped him on the shoulder. "A promise is a post you set in the ground, Will. It holds the wire long after you're gone." Will took the deed himself to the county clerk's office. He watched the clerk stamp it, the heavy thud of the machine echoing in the quiet room. He watched her record it in the heavy ledger book, the same book that sat in a cabinet in that very courthouse 47 years later. He paid the filing fee from his own pocket. It was a small act, a neighbourly gesture, but like a post set deep in the earth, it was meant to last. The years that followed were quiet. The first development on Parcel B went bust during the recession of the mid-70s. The land sat fallow for a decade, the fields slowly returning to scrub and wild grasses. Thomas Miller passed away in 1979. His children, living hundreds of miles away, kept paying the small property tax bill on the old homestead, Parcel A, but they never returned to live there. The house fell into disrepair, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling away in the sun and rain. The land around it grew wild. The large parcel was sold and resold, a line item on the balance sheets of distant investment firms. Each time, the title search focused on the valuable 400 acres. No one paid any attention to the thin, 12-foot-wide sliver that was Parcel C. It was just a line on a map, an anomaly. Eventually, the land was mortgaged to Sterling National Bank by a hopeful speculator who also went bankrupt, and so it ended up on the auction block. Through all those years, Will Croft remained. He married a woman named Eleanor, and they built a life on their own small farm, which bordered the old Miller place. They raised a daughter. They grew old together. Sometimes, on Sunday afternoons, they would walk the edge of their property, and Will would point out the overgrown path that was Parcel C. He would tell Eleanor the story of his promise to Thomas Miller. She understood the weight of such things. She was a woman who believed that a person's word was the truest thing they owned. "A promise is a post," she would say, echoing the words of the old farmer. "It's still holding the wire." She passed away 5 years before the auction. In the quiet, lonely months that followed, Will began the difficult task of sorting through their shared life, packed away in boxes in the attic. In a small shoebox filled with old photographs and letters, he found a folded, yellowed document. It was a carbon copy of the 1971 deed for Parcel C. He sat at his kitchen table and read it again, the legal language as clear and strong as the day it was written. A few weeks later, he saw the foreclosure notice in the local paper. Sterling National Bank versus the estate of a defunct LLC. For sale, Parcel B, 400 acres, and listed separately, almost as an afterthought, Parcel C, 0.72 acres, described as a drainage runoff. Will knew what the bank didn't. They had forgotten. Their city lawyers, with their computerized title searches, had looked for encumbrances on Parcel B. They had never considered that the key to the entire property was a separate parcel altogether. He didn't act immediately. He waited. He watched. He taught his grandson Leo about the land. He took him out to the fence line and showed him the 2 old metal stakes that marked the entrance to Parcel C from the county road, all but hidden now in a tangle of blackberry bushes. He explained what a deed was. He explained what an easement was. He explained what a promise was. "You can't just own things," he told the boy. "You have to be a steward of them." When the day of the auction came, he gave Leo $300 bills from a coffee can where he kept his savings. He told him exactly what to say and when to say it. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about money. It was about restoring something that had been bent back to straight. It was for Thomas Miller. It was for Eleanor. It was for the boy. Back in the present, the transaction was completed with a quiet formality that felt strangely disconnected from the tension in the room. Leo, guided by his grandfather, signed the purchase slip with a careful, steady hand. Will Croft counted out 3 crisp $100 bills and laid them on the table. The clerk, a woman who had worked in the courthouse for 30 years, took the money without comment and provided a receipt. The sale of Parcel C was officially recorded. The bank attorney, Davies, had been watching this unfold, his arms crossed, a look of strained patience on his face.
Now he walked over, his polished shoes clicking on the floor. He stopped in front of Will and Leo, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Quite the purchase, son," he said, his voice smooth and condescending. "What are you planning to do with a ditch? Grow prize-winning cattails?" Leo looked up at his grandfather. Will met the attorney's gaze. He hadn't spoken a word since entering the room, and when he finally did, his voice was low and even, without a trace of anger or triumph. "It's not a ditch." The simple, declarative sentence hung in the air. Davies's smile tightened at the edges. "I assure you it is. We had a full survey and title search done on the adjacent property, Parcel B. It's a non-buildable drainage runoff. Worthless, except perhaps to the county for storm drainage." This was his first argument, the one he believed was unassailable. The official process had been followed. The bank's experts had done their due diligence. He gestured vaguely with his hand, as if to dismiss the entire conversation. Will Croft did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply stated a fact. "It's a recorded access easement." Davies let out a short, disbelieving sigh. "No, impossible. As I said, the title search for Parcel B came back completely clean. No liens, no judgments, no encumbrances." He was confident, standing firmly on the ground of what he believed to be professional certainty. The developer stood beside him, nodding in agreement, eager to finalize his own purchase and get on with the business of earth movers and building permits. The few remaining farmers in the room had moved closer, forming a loose, silent circle. They didn't understand the legal terms, but they understood the confrontation. They understood the difference between the attorney's slick confidence and Will Croft's quiet certainty. Will looked at the attorney, then at the developer. His gaze was calm, patient. "You searched the wrong parcel." The words were not an accusation. They were a correction, a quiet statement of fact. For the first time, a flicker of doubt appeared in Davies's eyes. He had built his entire strategy on the integrity of the 400-acre parcel. It had never occurred to him or anyone at the bank to run a separate, detailed title history on a worthless strip of weeds. It was a failure of imagination. He couldn't yet see the trap he was in, but he could feel the edges of it closing around him. A frustrated energy began to radiate from the bank attorney. He was a man accustomed to control, to conversations that followed a predictable script. This was not on the script. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, a small, unconscious gesture of agitation. "Look," he said, shifting his weight, "this is his second angle, practical reasoning, an appeal to common sense. Even if there was some old, forgotten easement on the books, which I highly doubt, it's clearly been abandoned. That path hasn't been used in 50 years.
It's overgrown. For all legal purposes, any right of access is extinguished by non-use." He spoke with the authority of a law professor, certain that this argument would end the matter. He glanced at the developer, who nodded again, a little too quickly. Will Croft gave a slight shake of his head, a gesture so minimal it was almost imperceptible. "A recorded appurtenant easement runs with the land," he said. His use of the precise legal term was like a stone dropped into a still pond. It can't be abandoned through non-use, only by a formal, recorded deed of release from the owner of the dominant estate. The dominant estate. The phrase echoed in the quiet room. The developer's face, which had been a mask of confident impatience, now showed the first signs of genuine concern. He was beginning to understand. He looked at the plat map he held in his hand, then back at Will Croft. Davies, however, was not ready to concede.
He was paid to solve problems for the bank, to make obstacles disappear. He switched tactics again, his voice becoming softer, more reasonable. This was his third angle, the appeal to shared progress, the let's all be reasonable approach. Mr. Croft, is it? He paused, waiting for a nod. Mr. Croft, this is holding up progress. We are trying to build homes here, a community, jobs for local people. Surely we can come to a simple, practical arrangement. Let's not get bogged down in century-old paperwork. He smiled again, this time a conspiratorial, man-to-man smile. The bank is prepared to be generous. We'll buy Parcel C back from you right now. He reached into his jacket as if to pull out a checkbook. How about $400? $100 profit for the boy. A nice little lesson in business for him. He winked at Leo. It was a profound misreading of the man, the boy, and the situation. He was treating it as a negotiation over price, a simple financial transaction.
He still didn't understand that the currency of this conversation wasn't money.
Will Croft said nothing. He simply looked at the attorney, his silence a more powerful answer than any words could be. After a long moment, Leo spoke, his voice as clear as it had been when he made the bid. No, thank you. The politeness of the refusal was devastating. It shut the door on Davies's entire line of reasoning. The issue was not the price. The land was not for sale. The attorney stood there, his smile frozen on his face, his hands still inside his jacket. He had tried logic, law, and money. All three had failed. He was out of arguments. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The ticking of the wall clock seemed to grow louder, each second marking the slow, public dismantling of the bank attorney's confidence. The developer, no longer bothering to hide his anxiety, leaned in and whispered urgently in Davies's ear.
His words were inaudible, but his meaning was clear from his frantic gestures toward the plat map and then toward Will Croft. Davies's face was pale. He was cornered, and everyone in the room knew it. He turned, not to Will, but to the auctioneer, the only symbol of official authority present. Mr. Abernathy, he said, his voice strained, can we please clear this up? Can you pull the official county plat map for this section and the deed ledger for, he glanced at his notes, for 1971? Mr. Abernathy, who had been watching the exchange with a neutral, almost weary expression, nodded slowly. He was an older man, past retirement age, who had seen countless disputes play out in this room. He moved without haste to a large dark wood cabinet against the far wall. He opened one of the wide flat drawers with a key from a ring on his belt. He lifted out a heavy cloth-bound book and carried it to a large table in the centre of the room. He laid it down and opened it, the thick pages crackling. The map was old, hand-drawn in ink, the lines faded but clear. Davies, the developer, Will and Leo gathered around the table. The remaining farmers stood behind them, peering over their shoulders. Abernathy's finger, wrinkled and stained with ink, traced the boundaries of Parcel B. Then, with the same deliberate movement, he traced the thin straight line of Parcel C, a clean scalpel cut running directly through the larger property, connecting the small square of Parcel A to the thick line that represented the county road. He ran his finger along it again, from the road to the homestead, clear as day. He then went back to the cabinet and retrieved a second book, a thick ledger. He flipped through the pages, the paper rustling, until he found the entry he was looking for. His finger stopped. He read the entry silently for a moment, then looked up, not at Davies, but at the room. He spoke one decisive sentence. Parcel C was deeded and recorded on June 11th, 1971, as a permanent access easement for the benefit of Parcel A. The filing was signed by Thomas Miller and witnessed by William Croft. It's right here. He tapped the page. The words settled over the room like a fine dust. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The neutral party, the keeper of the county's records, had spoken. The truth, dormant for 47 years in a dusty book, was now awake. It was real. The developer made a low sound in his throat. He looked from the map to Davies, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He didn't need a lawyer to explain the consequences. His planned subdivision, a sprawling grid of streets and houses, had only one viable point of entry from the county road. That entrance was now bisected by a 12-foot wide strip of land owned by the old man and his grandson. A strip of land they could not build on, could not cross without permission, and could not move. The entire multi-million-dollar project was choked at its throat by a $300 plot of weeds. The bank's 400 acres, for all practical purposes, were now landlocked, worthless. Davies seemed to shrink inside his expensive suit. The confidence drained out of him, replaced by the frantic, calculating look of a man trying to salvage a disaster. He ignored the developer. He turned to Will Croft, his demeanour transformed. The condescension was gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading respect. He moved closer, lowering his voice as if to create a private space in the very public room. Mr. Croft, clearly there has been a serious oversight, an error in the bank's research. He was trying to frame it as a mutual problem to be solved. Sterling National is prepared to make a very significant offer to you for Parcel C, to rectify this mistake. Please, just name your price. He was speaking quickly, the words tumbling out.
He was back on familiar ground, the world where everything had a price, where every problem could be solved with a check. Will looked at him. His expression was unchanged. He had been waiting for this moment, not for the last hour, but for the last 47 years. It's not for sale. The 4 words were quiet, but they were absolute. Davies stared at him, unable to process the refusal. But everything is for sale, he stammered. Mr. Croft, what is it you want? A new truck? Pay off your farm? College for the boy? Just tell me what you want. Will's answer was simple. It addressed the purpose of the land, not its value. I want you to honour the easement. I want a clear path from the road to the Miller homestead. The developer, who had been listening, finally exploded. Honour it? We can't honour it. It cuts our entrance road right down the middle. We can't get construction vehicles in. We can't lay the utilities. It makes the whole project impossible.
His voice was rising, cracking with panic.
Will Croft said nothing. He didn't need to. He had already won. He simply stood there, a quiet steward, holding a promise made to a dead man. The room was quiet. The negotiation was over. There had never been a negotiation at all. The unravelling was swift and silent. The developer turned away from Will Croft and faced the bank attorney. I can't buy it, he said, his voice flat with defeat. The land is worthless to me. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply stated the new reality. He picked up his briefcase from the chair where he had left it, gave Davies a look of pure disgust, and walked out of the courthouse room without a backward glance. The sound of the heavy oak doors closing behind him was like a final judgment. The auction for Parcel B, the main event, was now dead. The bank had been hoping to recoup its losses, but now, with the access issue public knowledge, no one would bid. The asset was tainted, possibly for years to come. Davies stood alone in the middle of the room, his portfolio hanging limply from his hand. He took out his phone, looked at the screen, and then put it away without making a call. What could he possibly say? The other bidders, the farmers and locals, began to quietly file out. There was no gossip, no pointing, just a slow, silent exodus. They had seen what they came to see. A quiet man had reminded a powerful institution that the past is never truly gone. It just waits in dusty books and old cardboard tubes. Will Croft and Leo were among the last to leave. Before they went, Will walked to the table where the county clerk, Mr. Abernathy, was carefully closing the heavy ledger and the book of maps. Will laid the cardboard tube on the table. He uncapped it and with gentle hands unrolled the original 1971 deed. The paper was yellowed and brittle at the creases, but the ink was still dark. The signatures of Thomas Miller and a much younger Will Croft still clear. He smoothed it out on the table, a piece of paper that held more power than all the bank's money. He looked at it for a long moment, a pause. Then, just as carefully, he rolled it back up. He slid it into the cardboard tube and put the cap on. He had brought it as proof, but in the end, he had not even needed to show it. The truth was already there, waiting in the county's own records. He placed a hand on Leo's shoulder. They turned and walked toward the doors. Done. They passed by Davies, who was still standing, motionless, staring at the empty front row. Will didn't look at him. There was no gloating. There was no final cutting remark. The business was finished. Dignity had been restored, quietly, or not at all. The auction was over. A week later, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. Will and Leo were walking the 12-foot-wide strip of land. It was just as the attorney had described it, overgrown with weeds, thorny bushes and small saplings. But to them, it was not a ditch. It was a path. They each carried clearing tools, a scythe for Will, a pair of heavy loppers for Leo. They worked their way slowly from the county road, clearing a narrow trail down the center of the parcel. The work was hard, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and damp earth. They didn't talk much. The steady rhythm of the work was its own conversation. They stopped when they reached an old rusted T-post, nearly hidden in a thicket of wild roses. It marked the corner where Parcel C met the boundary of the old Miller homestead, Parcel A. Through the trees, they could just make out the sagging roofline of the abandoned house. Will ran his weathered hand over the rough, oxidized surface of the fence post. He looked out over the land, his land, Miller's land, the bank's useless land. "Some things are planted for the next man," he said, his voice quiet, directed more at the post than at the boy. Leo stopped his work and stood beside his grandfather. He looked at the post, then at the path they had begun to clear. He nodded. He understood that the work wasn't about clearing a path for a truck or a car. It was about clearing a path for a promise. They stood there for a moment longer as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was not about winning. It was about making things right. Some men collect problems. He collected patience. A promise kept for 47 years. A strip of land that held a bank hostage. If this story stayed with you, there's more like it. Next time, we go to Ohio, where a woman named Sarah Gable bought a dusty roll-top desk at an estate sale. Inside, she found a ledger from 1924. It wasn't the numbers that mattered. It was the name of the man who signed the bottom line. Stay with us.